Good. Happy to be here. Sorry for not being here yesterday. I had a long journey, but I made it. This joint work with Matthias Cantoni, I'm supposed to do the same thing as Rika. Matthias is going to be in the market in 3 years' time. He's going to be amazing, but he's not my student, so not formally. So I still advertise for him. So look out for Matthias when he's going to be in the market. So this is a paper on identity and institutional change, and we're going to look at first names in Germany. So there is I think every generation thinks of itself, or every generation post 1750 probably thinks of itself as witnessing an epochal moment. So, I was 9 years old and I watched my parents seeing the Berlin Wall coming down in 1989. We thought that was the end of history. People in 1945 thought it was an amazing moment to be alive in history. But now we're waiting for the AI singularity, and we're also thinking we're witnessing some amazing moment in history. For sure, people in 1789 were thinking that we're going through an amazing moment in history, and for sure, that was an important moment in history. So if you read what the contemporaries say, that this is Friedrich Kappes, a German intellectual publisher, that kind of public figure, around the time, says, our era has brought together, has brought together complete incompatible principles in the three generations alive. The enormous contrast of the years 1750, 1789, and 1815 lack any form of transition. So you have to imagine these people who go through, coming from a world that hasn't changed ideologically in 1,000 years, and all of a sudden Napoleon turning churches into horse stables and renaming the names of the months and those kind of things. That was short, that was wild. But people had the sense that nothing would ever be the same again, and for sure, yes, nothing was the same again, even if they tried this thing called restoration. So what we want to understand is how these kind of political shocks that clearly were massive were reflected in cultural choices by people at the time. So what we're going to look at is hopefully, I'm trying to convince you that we have a good measure of really trying to understand how these massive institutional choices that happen high up somehow, but are reflected down also in the daily lives of people, and we do think, and we're convinced that people did experience it on the ground. How these are reflected by their cultural practices, and specifically the cultural practice of choosing names for their kids. And so to some extent, you want to think about this as of in the sense that we also want to look at how these societies and these states evolved in the decades after this massive shock. You want to think about this as you're trying to understand how the culture, as expressed by those parents, helps selecting this new cultural equilibrium that then in turn supports institutional evolution over the course of the 19th century, which has massive consequences for the landscape, the political landscape of Europe as we know it. So more specifically, we're going to look at Germany at the turn to the 19th century, as you know, Germany is not France. It doesn't have the revolution, but it is massively affected by the revolution. So the French troops come in, they reorganize, they tear down this old and mostly rotten institutional conglomerate that is called the Holy Roman Empire, and do wild things. And then they, after 1815 Congress, again, everything gets reorganized. Some places experience, like that, but want to move it to the side?
People cannot see it. Yeah, the Zoom session is not.
Oh, okay. Perfect. Love it. Even better. They see me and I don't see them. Good. So what we're going to define at the end of the day, very practically, is going to be the experience of this institutional change broken down to the simple fact: did your ruling family change before 1789 and after the Congress of Vienna? Okay, now I have to click back again. I guess to return to focus here. And the outcome we're going to look at are our first names. So we have a data set collected by genealogists with 44 million birth and baptism records. Our very wild and rough guess is that it covers about 60% of the births in that period in time in Germany. And we'll basically break down all of this information. There will be a part, we've obsessed for over a year about how to think about these distributions. And there was a cul-de-sac where it got stuck up for a year trying to think about what's the best way to treat these multidimensional objects. And I'm not going to bore you too much, but for a while I gave this talk boring people to death with thinking about distributions and so on. But we're basically breaking down these distributions to distributions at the city times year level and see how these distributions of names, which are multidimensional objects, because you can characterize names, for example, based on their ideological content and so on, how these distributions change over time, and we're trying to link it. First of all, we're going to just give you a raw sense of, just the amount of change that happens, and then we're trying to link it to what we see as emerging as the main ideological currents that emerge in the 19th century. I will be very frank to you. It's a friendly audience, so I can confess to you how we got to this topic in the sense that, when we got this, we tried to get this data, and, I thought that, the interesting action would go on in the 1820s, 30s, building up to 1848, the rise of nationalism and so on. When we first saw the data, there was this massive punching in your eyes, this massive change in the 1790s. And so then we started to understand, okay, the really interesting thing that is going on is not this buildup of nationalism in the first half of the 19th century, but it's this massive shock in the 1790s. Really, it's really a punch in your eyes once you see the data. And so that's why we started to think, okay, really, this institutional shock, it is an institutional uncertainty, and how it's reflected by individual choices is what is first order, and what we want to get interested in. So to some extent, our paper is not what our original hypothesis was. So that's my confession here. Yes.
Maybe you'll get to it so you can postpone, but how was it received, the French Revolution in Germany? Were they happy about it? Was it there were newspapers back then.
Yes.
Only a certain percentage of the population read.
Yes.
How did they?
There's part of it will be reflected afterwards, but it's a good question because I don't address it explicitly. Maybe we should. There is a certain mostly friendly reception in the first years when the troops arrive as basically the liberators and bring in the ideals of the French Revolution, which turns sour over the later years when Napoleon comes in and occupies more territories and creates his satellite states. We're also going to see this originate in the treatment, in fact, that people who experience the first part of the invasion are happy about it. And in fact, there's a lot of, an old paper with General Johnson Robinson on this, that people in the Rhineland loved it. And after the French left, they begged to keep the institutions of the French. Whereas the ones that were occupied afterwards, outside the Rhineland, they hated it. And the whole narrative of the 19th century in Germany is the rise of nationalism as a reaction in distinction from the French. So again, we're Germans, we're not French. The horrible French did these terrible things to us. That's why we're different. We need our own nationality. We need our. Sorry?
What year did were these wars with?
So the French come in 1790 in the Rhineland, and then Napoleon comes in and creates his satellite states that are much less loved in the 1800s. Yeah.
How much does sort of settlement and immigration play a role? Is there also an effect of this because you have all these massive armies rolling through?
Yeah, you'll see that you're not see it because it's one of the many things that I took out of this presentation for today because I have only 40 minutes and my experience is that, I always make fun of Noam that he never gets, my beloved co-author and friend, that he never goes beyond his introduction after 45 minutes. But I'm getting older, I'm converging towards Noam, and so my experience is that I never get beyond. But, one of the many exhibits that I have that I used to have in the presentation is about this, and we don't see a direct effect of the experience of the troops, for example. And it's not even migration. So we try to see, do we see that the effect in the sense of, do we see these effects that I still haven't talked about being influenced by external information sets? For example, again, troops coming in or immigration, and it's not driven by that. So the argument that I'll make, if I get to it, is that it's basically a bottom-up and endogenous development. All right, so what we find is we'll see, this dramatic and persistent shift in the 1790s, okay? And it is an enormous peak in the 1790s, and it is a consequence, and it is related, at least spatially, to where people experience this institutional turnover. When we try to characterize this change in terms of what kind of ideologies are gaining, which ones are losing, we see that there's a turn towards more nationalism, more religious identities, and away from identities that are traditional in the sense that they're related to, say, the names of the old dynasties ruling there. And our interpretation is that this is a world where all of a sudden you have a massive state vacuum. There's lots of interesting anecdotes about people, they take down the statues from the streets, but people don't even know where to go now. There are no courts anymore. They don't know who the ruler is. And so you have this other bottom-up identity providers, mostly the church and the rising nationalist movements, who start, basically providing people with identities. And then, the part that I'll never get to because I don't have time, in the end, we have some, correlational evidence that these changes that we experience are also related to later outcomes like the 1848 revolution. But, this is a preview that I'll never get to. Okay, this is a, very high level, broad slide in lieu of a literature review. For sure, there's a conference on narratives and culture. How can we contribute to this very broad field? I think, one of the ways we like to think about our project is that we can really, think about how this cultural evolution takes a turn by observing it in this critical juncture, in this moment where, you have this massive institutional shock, this massive uncertainty. People don't know who to turn to, and we can observe it because we look at these first names that are basically a real-time measure of what people want to express. We can really have a capture of how this cultural evolution happens in as things happen. And to some extent, that's I think what we want to contribute to the sense that most of the great literature that we have on say the interplay between culture and evolution, often looks at outcomes many years later. And many years later, you have, for example, this kind of uncertainty that you have about institutional trajectories where you end up, what's the new equilibrium, that has been resolved. So if you do a long run regression between some shock in the past and today, you miss all the parts, especially when you have this uncertainty. When you have people in 1798 in the Rhineland did not know what the long run settlement would be. And so that's what we think is exactly interesting in this setting. And to some extent, we like to think of this shock also not just as a first moment shock, but also second moment shock. Okay, so people really experience not just the shock of losing their old rulers and not knowing what comes next, but also for massive uncertainty. Every couple of years, someone new would be coming in, some new settlement would be agreed on until the Congress of Vienna. So to some extent, we like to relate this also to this framework by Paula Giuliano and Nathan about if you live in a more uncertain environment, the value of culture and of inheriting certain cultural traits to your kid is different than if you live in a more stable environment. Certainly, people in the 1790s moved from a world that was very stable to a world that was very, very uncertain and unstable. Okay, so very quickly, what's the historical context? The historical context is quote unquote Germany. So the Holy Roman Empire. It's a world that, again, to connect to my previous point about Giuliano Nan and the stability of the environment and so on, it's a world that is very, very stable. The Holy Roman Empire was at least claimed to be 1,000 years old. That's why the other guy later on wanted to create the other 1,000-year Reich. Most people didn't have the same dynasty for 1,000 years, but in our data, the median city has had the same ruling dynasty for 280 years. So, you've really not experienced much change. On top of that, as a consequence of the religious wars of the 15th century, people lived in very homogeneous societies. So everybody around them was either Catholic or Protestant. Then, the French come in, Napoleonic troops come in, they, tear down all the old dynasties, they reorganize it a couple of times. And then as a consequence of the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Germany gets reorganized with the Restoration. In the end, you have about 41 territories, of which basically only 10 to 15 are really important. The rest are kind of small territories. But you move from a world with, in principle, over 1,000 territories, but realistically about 200 plus territories, to a world with about 15 territories that matter. So for most people, they experience a change in the ruling dynasty. And so now all of a sudden, they're not ruled by the same dukes or kings that have been ruled for 280 years. They get names of new rulers that they don't know. And often on top of that, this kind of reorganization was done on a table in Vienna without any regard to what the sensitivities on the ground were, what cultural cleavages were on the ground, and so on. And so all of a sudden now you have states that are actually bringing together Catholics and Protestants, for example, which you didn't have before. So there are states of, for example, Prussia, that used to be a Protestant state, that now has a sizable Catholic minority in there who resents the Prussian rulers, not only because they're new rulers, because on top of that, they're also Protestant.
Okay. Should we think of the heterogeneity across ruling dynasties as just religion, or are there other dimensions that, like, do they differ in terms of other?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to make much of the I'm not going to characterize them before. Yeah, for sure, some of them are more well connected in the sense that, they're Habsburgs or they're, closely related. Some are not. I think one important heterogeneity in pre-1789 territories is that a good chunk of them is ecclesiastical territory. So they're ruled by a prince bishop. Okay, so in that case, it's not a dynasty. So, of course, nominally, at least the prince bishop didn't have kids. So for them, the change was, of course, very salient in the sense that all of a sudden you have a secular ruler, not a religious ruler anymore. Okay, and as I've already alluded before, we think of this, want to characterize this as a world where for at least 15 years, people experience a massive state vacuum. They don't know who is in charge. And that's where you start seeing these bottom-up actors becoming more active. So one of them is the nationalist movement that really, picks up in that period in time. Most, later on, most saliently as a reaction to the French in distinguishing itself from the French, but also there's also religious revival. There's, with a lot of nice quotes that people, start, religion becomes much more salient, especially when you're in a minority group now in a bigger territory. For example, for the Catholics in the Rhineland, their Catholicity becomes much more salient now that they're a minority. And on top of that, the church is freed from being this kind of, basically state religion as it was before. So now you can act independently of the state, and of course that gives a completely different action space for the church.
I'm curious, in this context of state vacuums, together with this like rising nationalism and the religious movement or the ecclesiastical hierarchy, is there also room for these typical medieval Western local self-government institutions to kind of coordinate either together with the rising nationalism or ecclesiastic, like they could maybe help to spread.
Yes.
I'm thinking also in terms of these pre-colonial institutions in Africa, the colonial rulers come and they encounter these already kind of political complexity in place, which can help them maybe transfer their technology, their knowledge.
Yeah, so my interpretation of the history of the time is that it's a world in which you have after the restoration, after Congress, you have these new ruling dynasties in place, but we're still in a world with relatively low state capacity, right? And so they're not really, we're still in a world before universal education, for example, and so on. So they're not. That's why I don't put the new states as identity providers here, and we don't see basically people resorting to this, state or pre-existing, state-like structures in organizing, say, collective action, for example. So what we see is the church becoming active, and what we see is this new nationalist movement. Okay, so this is the reorganization. In the end, you have 41 territories out of just 10 to 15 are the big ones, or Russia, Baden, Württemberg, Bavaria, Hanover, and so on. So our data are 44 million birth records. They come from the Genealogical Society of Utah, which I'm not supposed to call them Mormons, but they're Mormons. So they're the Church of Latter-day Saints, as a church of whatever. As you know, they are behind Family Search and Ancestry. It's very hard to get their data. It took us 5 years of bugging them with an email every week. And at some point, all of a sudden, they send us the data with no way to inquire anything else. But we got the data from them, so I would not recommend any graduate student to try to get this data because it will take longer than your graduate studies. Our guess, again, it covers about 60% of the births roughly in that period of time in that coverage. The coverage is all across Germany, mostly in the West, with fewer. There's no way to communicate with the Mormons or try to understand why some areas have coverage, some not. Our understanding is that basically they enter agreements with local archives, church archives, and with some of them they entered agreements, some of them not. We mapped this to cities, to the 2,000 cities in Germany that we coded in the past with the Städtebuch. So the unit of observation is the city. So even if you're born outside the city, we assign you to the closest city. We do a lot of standardizing. We could I could bore you for an hour of how you standardize names. And there's an interesting question: is Hans just a diminutive of Johannes or not, or is it a different name? So there are choices that you can make there. None of our results depend on the choice. And then for the stuff that I won't be able to present to you at the end, we'll also have biographical data on individuals, their careers, and their activism in the 1848 revolution.
So I'm trying to understand what is the friction in the data. in terms of some location not represented, because they couldn't find the partner of the.
Yeah, if you want, the minimalist answer is, our results are internally valid for the cities that we have in the sample.
But
With a fairly, for the places where we have records, it seems to be quite complete. So, it seems like, say, if the Mormons had an agreement with the bishopric of Fulda, it seems like, for the area around Fulda, we have all the cities for every years. We don't have many missings. You're right. I never ran sort of a zero stage of saying predicting which locations are covered by the data and which not. I could do that. All right. I could also bore you, as I said before, with a long discussion of the measures that we have. The important thing to understand, or it took me a long while to understand, and there's also a long discussion about finite sample bias, and we had an analogy for a while with language models and so on. But names are a name distribution is a complex object in the sense that you go to a village and you see all the kids born in that year in that place, and you could have many theories as to why people choose these names, right? First of all, you could just look at names without assigning them to categories, but just looking at the distribution might be interesting. But then ideally you might also want to know, is it the first child, the second child? Typically there's some naming rules for the first children, but not for the second children. If your first son is born, maybe you recycle the name, those kind of things. All of these things, sorry, we can't do because we don't have last names in our data. So we can't do a within family variation, which would be ideal. The distribution of names on top of that is finite in the sense that ideally, for every place and time, we would want to see 1 million kids being born, right? To see, how would they have named not just the first and the second kid, but also the third and the fourth. And so we have to learn a lot, and that, that's where we got conceptually stuck for a while. We have to learn something about the culture and the place and the time with a very limited sample. Okay, and so we do apply some finite sample correction that we take from the language models literature. But without boring you with this, if you look at the distribution, the first two things that you want to do before even characterizing the type of names is saying, well, let's look at the distribution in one place, say Fulda in 1719 and 1800. We look at the distribution, we just want to say how different are the two distributions. And to compare to distribution, you can take many measures, for each of the measures, we have 3 robustness checks and 3 additional tables. Or if you don't like this, we have others, as Groucho Marx said. We use a tag or Thiel index, whatever you want to call it, which is just a measure of how different two distributions are. Okay. Then once you look at the distribution at one point in time, you want to say how concentrated is it? Do 60% of the kids have the same name, or has every kid a different name? And again, you could use a Herfindahl index or whatever you want. What we use is basically the number of unique names divided by the number of births in that year. Okay, so if there's 100 kids being born, but 50 are named Johannes and 50 are named Jakob, it's 2 over 100. Okay, you think it's an extreme case? Well, not. Okay, up to 1790, 50% of the kids were called Johannes in most populations that we have. So it's a very concentrated thing that moves very quickly. In the 1820s, that share goes down to 20 to 30%, for example. Then, yeah.
We also try to do TF-IDF scores and comparing sort of names of one place and names of another, because it will be a very simple.
No, we don't. We only compare within places. We only compare within changes. But yeah.
I think it will still work. But
yeah, let's talk. So I have another 15 minutes. Is that true? No, 20, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So then we assign the names to different ideological flavors. And again, we've tried with a lot of different definitions and so on. But what seems kind of consistent is that there are 3 flavors essentially. One is the one that will decline. I'll show you that it will decline is loyalism. So what we take is basically the names of your ruling family. So if you're in Bavaria, that would be Ludwig and Maximilian because that's the name of the kings of Bavaria, right? If you're in Prussia, it's Friedrich and Wilhelm because that's the name of the kings of Prussia and so on. Religion, there are many funny religious naming books. They differ a lot by Protestant and Catholic. They're very traditionally Catholic names, very traditionally Protestant names. They're all biblical names, but they're different flavors. We found many funny little manuals that basically tell their kids, if you want your kid to be a proper Protestant, that's the name you should give to them. And nationalism is the same. There are books that come up in the 1810s, 1820s that tell your kids, if you want your kid to have a proper Germanic name, you should call him this way. And they even say the spelling. Right, if you want to name your kid Adolf to make a random choice, you should spell him with PH, not with F. So that guy from from Austria was actually not the proper German because it was spelled that. Yes.
But are this data from the Mormon Church? So do you think some of those are people were like immigrants to the US later on, or are they like more represented in that sample than other Germans?
Well, I would need to check. I don't know. I mean, if I map our distributions, you say I should check them and compare them to the immigration records. Yeah. Yeah, I could do it. That's, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that would be an interesting way to get again at the selection.
They are
Yeah.
more drawn from like the indentured servants and those like different social classes.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that would be interesting to find out. Yeah, you know, of course, yeah, certainly they're not upper class much. Yeah. So if you look at the top top 5 names in each group, again, it sort of I think confirms to most of people's priors. The loyalists names the ones of kings and royalty of Friedrich, Karl, and so on. The nationalists are named like Edward. No, Edgar. No, not really. Not perfect. We have a Bernhard or a Robert here, and these are good German nationalist names like Bertha and Clotilde. And then we have the religious names that are the classic, basically, names from the Bibles and the evangelists. All right, so
And here's a way to check whether influential people, like, people, the mayor or somebody, are changing the names that they give their kids, and then the rest of society
yeah.
following.
That's a good question. We don't do that. One of the ways actually that I was very proud of, but now we've changed it, but we could use it again, is that we basically try to infer these names not from dictionaries, but from revealed choices. So we would take, for example, for the nationalists, we take people who are active in the nationalist movement. We don't take their names, but we take names that they give their kids, and we define those as nationalist names, for example. Then you can do a kind of Fryer-Levis score of that. But seeing, we do see, to some extent, that's what happens here, right? If you name your kids after the rulers, that's it. But that's the most extreme case. But then, you can think about lower levels too. It's a good idea. Yeah. Okay.
I think of another dimension of war. So you have granular war data of that time, and I wonder if names that are closer to battles was like Martial or something like that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we can pin down places of battles and so on. We thought of the battles and the passing through, the marching through of troops as basically an external identity supply, and we don't see any heterogeneity there. But maybe we didn't see heterogeneity, maybe specific names, yeah. I mean, for sure, there's a period in which people like to name their kids Napoleon, right? It's very short, it turns sour very quickly. But I mean, you can Google. Sorry, but I love this anecdote. There's a website that says revolutionary names used in France. Of course, you want to name your kids Robespierre and so on. But my favorite one is Germinal and those kind of names from the Revolution. But my favorite is Mort Bourgeois, death to the bourgeois, as a first name. Okay, back to series. So this is basically the graph that I told you before was a punch in our eyes. So this is basically the sorry, this one here. This is the Thiel index or tile index. Basically, that's a rate of churning essentially, the year to year or here decade to decade difference of the distribution in naming within place. Okay, so holding place constant of my place in this decade compared to the previous decade. So all of these are basically rates of change. And as you can see, all of this is standardized. So don't look at this. Of course, it's negative, but it's not negative. The rate of change is always positive. But as you can see in the world before 79, it's kind of stable. We're in a world that is, again, it's a stable world. It's a long durée. It's a world that doesn't change much. And the strategy that works for your parents works for your kids. If your parents were named Johannes and did well in life or miserably in life as you did before, Johannes is going to be good enough for your son too. Okay, and then all of a sudden this rate of change goes up massively. Okay, so that was what really got us to think. Okay, the interesting action here happens in the 1790s, and of course, if you map it to the fraction of cities, actually not territories, changing rulers. Again, it's a world that is very stable beforehand. There are many decades in which basically no city changes rulers because there are no wars, everything is stable, the institutional setting is stable. And then you have 2 decades in which, decade by decade, 40% of the city change their ruler. Okay? So what we do essentially is we derive a measure of treatment. So as you can see here, that's a treatment that I defined before. It's essentially whether a city has a different dynasty after 1815, after the Congress of Vienna than before. In between, there's much more action happening. So, a lot of these cities, for example, are also treated in between. But what we want to look at is this permanent change. If you look at only the temporary change, you're going to get a lot of noise. Okay, so these are cities that had a different ruler, different ruling dynasty before 1789 than after 1850. And if you basically take the graph before and split it by, treated, non-treated, I'm gonna call them now, you see that, both of them experience institutional change and both of them reflect institutional change in their naming patterns. So of course, also the untreated places try out new names, churn their names from which they choose from. But the treated places are the ones that have the bigger effect, and it's also one that is, more permanent towards, and the other one you have a convergence afterwards. Pardon?
It's a change the rule. Do you think that is it the case of that we have specific model in the line that or is it completely new?
No, changing ruler is a new dynasty in our definition.
Right, but
So it's a completely different ruling family.
There is a second level, the dialogue is already very powerful, but it's ready to step in and encourage the dialogue.
Yeah,
Or is it kind of a
no, in most of the cases, it's completely unrelated. Yeah, I think the modal change is you were ruled by a prince bishop before, the bishops are gone, and now you're ruled by Prussia. Okay, or you're ruled by a little duke that rules over one city, and now you're part of, say, Bavaria. So that's a modal change that we. So, you can do the same thing basically in a regression. I'm not going to bore you with the regression definition. So you see that, the effect is there, but more interesting, if you look at the event study, you see, very, again, I think I've never drawn an event study graph that looked so great from the beginning, where, it's really kind of flat beforehand, and then you have the effect setting off right away, both in terms of the rate of change, so the Peel index, and in the dispersion. So how long the tail of the distribution of names is.
Maybe you said it and I didn't catch it. Why do you think you have the difference already, the pre-existing difference?
That one.
Yeah.
No, I didn't say it, and I have no prior. Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, it's not significant. That would be my cheap answer now. But
That's
yeah.
my point, but I think, well, I mean, it'd just be interesting to see,
Yeah.
to have an idea why that might.
Good point. Yeah.
It just makes you think that there was something different already in the treated areas, and maybe they're bigger, maybe they're.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of rule is very different there. Again, it's typically smaller states with religious dynasties and so on. To some extent, there is, and that is basically
It
the point
doesn't
here.
invalidate anything you're doing.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. And to some extent, there's a longer conversation to be had also about, clearly, I didn't try to convince you that that's random, that that's quasi-random or whatever. Certainly, the places that got treated are different than the ones that are not treated. As I said before, they're typically smaller state, religious states, and so on. We do, we do an IV as well, which, because some people like that. But I think the more convincing part here is where we really trying to think about the process that led to this change. And so we have 5 different simulations, 5 alternative scenarios to derive alternative control groups. My favorite one is this one here. The Congress of Vienna had a statistical commission that collected data to try to, in this kind of market of cities, you Prussia get this, you Saxony get this, no, let's swap and so on, to make sure that, the swaps were kind of equivalent. They collected data about all the cities and they defined sets of cities that they could swap between each other. And so this basically gives you an alternative scenario of, maybe this part could have gone to Saxony and not this one. And so if we do, for example, the analysis only on that, we get very similar results.
Yeah, if I understand correctly, you said that there is kind of another treatment, which is that there is centralization, like a moving of states, right?
Yeah.
Which I don't know if you control for that or if it's part of the story, but it's not only you change rulers, but some places have much bigger territory, and that can change the type of local attachment.
Yeah.
You can get.
Yeah, okay, I should be more explicit. I'll get to something similar in a second, hopefully. Yeah, William?
I almost think the change seems obviously kind of puzzle in a sense, but then instead of separating out the treatment and control, it's trying to understand why some places had a bigger change than others. Why did some of the places that weren't changed, they still had, is it spillovers or
Yeah.
Why are some places more receptive?
Yeah, so I very much take your suggestion here. This is some of the things that we, chat, and I think, most of them are, and we could do many more. I'm happy to hear, other ideas on how to go about. So, what are heterogeneities that sort of intensify the effect of the treatment? And again, not claiming causality here, none of that is randomly assigned, but just to give a sense of, what is going on. The effect is stronger if you were ruled by the same family for more years before. Okay, so if you had the same dynasty for 500 years and then that one disappears, it's a bigger shock than if you just change the ruling dynasty. If you were the location of an administrative center before, and if you were the capital of a territory or the location of a court or any administrative building, the effect is stronger because the state vacuum is going to be bigger to some extent. And this is basically contraction measures, how much your previous territory has contracted. So if it's zero, if your territory hasn't changed, it's negative if your previous territory has expanded, and it's 1 if your previous territory has completely disappeared. Okay, and so if your previous territory has completely disappeared, again, that strengthens the impact of the shock. Okay, so let me, I have 5 minutes. So as I said before, we don't think this is driven by external information like troops telling you or giving you information. We try to control for migration. It's not this. We think this comes bottom up, and this comes bottom up from actors that try to fill the state vacuum. And the two of them are the church and nationalism, as I said before. If we look at, I'm not going to show you the regressions. If you look at the effect on the shares of names, depending whether they're nationalist, religious, or the names of rulers, you see that nationalist names go up, religious names go up, loyalist names go down. Okay, and it's especially the loyalist names of your future dynasty. Okay, so you reject. So if you're assigned to Prussia, and maybe you liked Wilhelm as a name, and Wilhelm was a name in your family tradition, but now you're assigned to Prussia, you hate the Wilhelms that are kings, you stop using Wilhelm as a name. Whereas if you did the same by defining loyalist name as only the name of your previous dynasty, you're not going to get this. Okay, so I think this is very, very persuasive in a sense. It's really this kind of oppositional identity that comes up once you're assigned to a new territory. Or sorry?
If you have a diagram for the previous rulers.
Yeah. Oh, I don't remember. I think Matthias told me it's mush. It's basically mostly flat and non-significant. But things that we tried out this week.
It reflects with the previous
yeah. It doesn't go up in a sense. It's not like they reminisce the old ruler and they now use the name. It was basically flat. I think that was flat. Yes.
Can you really tease out whether it's a change in identity or a change in signaling group membership?
No. I mean, how would I parse it out? Yeah, I mean,
it's kind of hard to claim that
yeah.
it's a cultural change, right? It could just be that now I want to signal membership to your group, or it's a new ruler, I want to signal loyalty for the
yeah, so you clearly don't want to signal loyalty to the new rules. You want to signal positional identity to the new rulers. Is it an individual effect? Is it a group effect? Again, the thing is that I don't know, the network structure within these places, for example. So I don't know if it's stronger within people in the same family group or so on. If I had that information, that would be, yeah.
I wonder if there is any changes in fertility going on and differentially, and if there's any correlation between fertility and the amount of dispersion in names.
Yeah, so that was the big concern we had. Remember I said before, finite sample bias. Of course, if you draw more draws from the distribution in a place, you get the different distribution of names. For example, if you have the 12th kid, than if you have only 9 kids. There are slight differences in fertility. We're way before the fertility transition here, right? There's slight differences in levels in fertility, no big changes. And when we apply these finite sample corrections, all of these results are with the finite sample correction, but it doesn't make a difference. Okay, just as one more heterogeneity, when we look at the effect of nationalists, religious, and loyalists, if we look at the effect of being occupied by the French, you see that again, it goes in the direction you expect. If you are occupied by the French, you're more likely to choose German nationalist names afterward as a reaction, and you're less likely to use the loyalist names. So the first one is the one that I would think is more interesting. Okay, I have 1 minute left. Just to show you the things that I promised I wouldn't have time to show you, namely, we also see that in these places, we look at biographical data, the Deutsche Biografie, which is this big biography of all notable people in Germany. These places that are treated are more likely to produce people who are later on known and then come to fame in the biography for their nationalist deeds. So they become, for example, freedom fighters. They're more likely to produce people who go into a career in the church, and they're less likely to produce people who are, loyalists, we say people who are administrators, ministers, and functionaries in government, and so on. And we have also some correlation, and this is just cross-sectional, this is not at the place level, This is just so it is not the place in zero, this is across Germany, that the places that are treated, and that kind of we knew, are more likely to create these nationalist festivals in the 1820s and 30s that are going to prelude to the 1848 revolution. They're more likely to create these German national associations, these gymnastics associations, and they're more likely to be the birthplace of people who are active in the 1848 revolution. All right, I think I'm out of time, but I made it through the slides. So again, we think this kind of changing naming patterns is striking, and we think we have a good framework to think about this as capturing this massive institutional, capturing it as a reflection of the massive institutional uncertainty that people were experiencing at the time. And I'm grateful for also being more suggestions on how to really pin it down. What could be factors that, for example, exacerbate this feeling of institutional change. Well, thank you so much.